Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and you're listening to the TheoCon podcast.
Hello, hello, hello. And I'm Sarah Lane Ritchie. Nice to be with you all. TheoCon, theology at a time of crisis, because we are all living in a time of crisis right now. And we are going to be bringing you a series of live events over the next few weeks. And we want all of you to be a part of it.
We are talking theologians, philosophers, biblical scholars, ecological activists, and faith community leaders, all a part of TheoCon. We want you to hear their keynotes, but more than that, we want you to engage in the live streaming panel discussions. So make sure you sign up. All you have to do is go to theologycon.com, sign up. You'll get invitations to each of the live sessions, be able to submit questions, and you will get the video and audio for all the sessions delivered right to your email box. Our goal is to bring the resources of the Ivory Tower right into your earbuds and on your computer screen.
It sounds too easy and too good to pass up. So who are we going to be hearing from today?
Philip Clayton. That's right. Philip is from Claremont School of Theology, and he is here as part of the religion and science conversation with Norman Wurzba. And on the 30th of June, you can join the live stream. Send us in your questions, engage them live on the interwebs. All you need to do to get the invite is sign up at theocon.com. All right, here he is, my buddy, Philip Clayton.
My thanks to Trip Fuller and Sarah Lane Ritchie for the invitation to speak about theology in a time of crisis, and in this particular lecture, science and religion in a time of crisis. I'll think of it as a call to moving beyond value-free theology and therefore beyond the pretense to a value-free approach to the science and religion discussion, something that unfortunately we have pursued more often than we should have. Some years ago, I had the chance to organize a session on science and spirituality, science and ecology at the World Parliament of Religions in Melbourne, Australia. We invited a number of illustrious people in science and religion to speak, and one of those speakers was the Nobel Prize winner in medicine and physiology, Peter Doherty. He presented slides on the climate crisis, which in 2009, not many of the people present, the spiritual leaders from around the world, were taking very seriously. At least they didn't know the data. So he presented all these data slides, and then at the end, he walked to the front of the stage and he looked out over this auditorium of 300 religious leaders. He said, I have spent the years since I received the Nobel Prize presenting this data to groups of scientists and lay people around the world, and I have not found a resonant response. It has not changed behavior. Though I am not religious in any way, I accepted the invitation to come to speak to this gathering, the World Parliament of Religions, because religion is about changing people's lives. It's about transformation. It's about fundamental values. And I felt that if I could bring the data and you could use whatever it is that causes people to change their lives, that there might actually be a place of connection, that we might be able to work together. I as a non-religious scientist, you as religious non-scientists. Maybe we could do something powerful together. Those words stuck with me as a person who had already been working in science and religion for some time by then. I had always headed much more toward the most abstract areas of philosophy and the religion science debate. Theory of rationality or theory of truth, questions of knowledge in epistemology, metaphysics, and only the most abstract kind, the interpretation of quantum mechanics, theoretical biology, debates like what is the unit of selection, or how does emergent complexity work, or how would you quantify information or the growth in complexity, or what are the neural correlates of consciousness. Areas of science and philosophy that I found fascinating. But there was something that made me uncomfortable about meeting Peter Doherty. It wasn't long after that, actually probably within a year, when I was in a lecture that John Cobb Jr. held. John Cobb was the keynote speaker for the series that I had set up on faith and the future of the planet. And I remember his talk where he talked about global warming and the likely effects on particular societies and human beings, and the number of deaths, the increase in poverty, the shortening of lifespan, more and more people immigrating from their countries because of the danger, a collapse of crops, starvation, lack of water, and so forth. And it was rather sobering, even though he's such a pleasant kind of gentleman, as you can see in the picture. So I raised my hand at the end and said, so you think that there'll be a large number of deaths because of the climate? And, would that be, how big is this thing that's heading toward us? And in his calm and understated way, John Cobb said, well, the deaths will be in the hundreds of millions and probably billions. I remember walking out that evening into the dark and thinking about what John Cobb had said. Somehow it made the kinds of issues that I dealt with in science and religion discussions seem too abstract, not urgent enough. I would say that I still study science, but now with the goal of understanding ecological systems and the increasing effects of climate change. Mostly I seek to understand the science in order to see what's the human role in the Anthropocene, in this new age where we are the fundamental geological force changing the face of the planet, we human beings. I want to study data that brings us back to the earth and shows what science can tell us, and then what are the resources of the religions that can cause an appropriate response. So this is the sort of data, this is the compelling data from various different measures for human-caused, anthropogenic increase in temperatures on the planet. The role of the spike is too small of a word in human population, as you can see, since the modern period and since then, numbers that are far beyond the carrying capacity of this planet. And then this slide, in its many forms, represents a way of reading and presenting science. The difference between the two bars is this historic surface temperature and then emission of greenhouse gases. And you can see that the decision point is here in the time that we're living. If we bring the greenhouse gas emissions back under control, keep them flat, decrease them now because this is slightly older data, then we leave a planet that's at least in continuity with the way it's been over the last 300 million years. If we act selfishly, then this graph goes up well above the 2 degrees Celsius. There are scenarios where 4 is not unlikely by the end of the present century, and 6 happens. And science is actually very good about telling us what life will look like on this planet if we don't take the steps that keep this line down here. So what does that mean concretely as you think about some of these changes? Well, when we map the impacts of climate change, we notice the particular vulnerability to part of the world, namely the poorest parts of the world. They are the ones who will most suffer the physical impacts and who have contributed the least by their lifestyles toward the change from which they will suffer the most. That would be, in a sentence, the definition of injustice. If you look agriculturally, yields, again, the same roughly equatorial region suffers the most, and the more wealthy countries do the best. in increased agricultural yields. The severe water shortages will be massive, again, across that same district. And there'll be increase in water in the northern latitudes. And then we recognize how human consumption is changing while moving, for example, demand for meat products, moving rapidly, that all people will try to live in the way that Europeans and North Americans have lived, something that the planet cannot sustain. In short, our footprint becomes completely destructive. In the American Academy of Religion last year, 2019, in San Diego, the most famous society in the field of science and religion, ISSR, held a session, sponsored a session called Rebooting Science and Religion. What I am talking about is in effect a rebooting of the field of science and religion. It has us challenge three things: the abstract study of science only for its epistemic pieces, abstract or knowledge as such. It has us challenge the religious studies bias in the study of religion that seeks to study religion in an objective way, a cultural value, if I may, that has affected how we study and present theology as well, and definitely has affected the discipline of science and religion, how we approach it. And then finally, I think it involves a rebooting of some ways that we study and do theology. Specifically, it challenges the historical, the systematic, and the analytic reduction of theology. Yes, that's a strong word. I'll come back to it later. So how did we get to this place? We agree, how do we get to this place? We agree that religions are not morally or ethically neutral. Somehow we got the idea that the study of religions should be value-free. But the things we're studying are ways of recommendations of living life well, of human flourishing. They are laden with values through and through, from the nature of the divine, from the way in which prophets and teachers have shared those messages. Philosophy. Modern philosophy thought that metaphysics should be a matter of pure logic and rational intuition. Somehow this rubbed off on theology. For example, Augustine and Anselm didn't view their theology as neutral. They wrote theology in the form of prayer. Think of the Confessions, or the so-called ontological proof of the existence of God, which arises in the form, is stated in the form of a prayer by St. Anselm around the year 1100. Something changed. How can we rethink from this point? Well, religion and science may not have been thinking of crisis. Definitely not in my training and most of my career. But students of ecology and the environment who were studying the planet did think in that way. We may have come to think that science and religion should be value-free, but the students of the planet were not making those claims. So let's step back a little bit and find some new resources. In fact, let's imagine the study of the earth. This is a famous quote from Caldecott, could go back to learn something from environmental ethics. A non-anthropocentric environmental ethic as a way to radicalize and to rethink and to reboot science and religion as such. Perhaps the most famous of these statements, core statements, in fact, for me, I suppose the birth of contemporary environmental ethics comes from this famous quote from Aldo Leopold: examine each question in terms of what is ethically and aesthetically right, as well as what is economically expedient. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Completely clear focus on that core earth principle. Biocentric principle, we would call it. And that led then Leopold to develop the land ethic, recognizing how ecology continually enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, animals, or in general, the land. This requires us to rethink the role of Homo sapiens from a conqueror of the land community to, I love this, a plain member and citizen of it. It requires respect for the other fellow members and also for the whole community of life, the biotic community as such. Here's a discipline where values are built right at the first step. This is exactly what I'm saying we need to do in rebooting science and religion. So Brennan and Lowe define environmental ethics as a result as the discipline that studies the moral relationship of human beings to, and also the value and moral status of, the environment and its non-human contents. I'll just let you skim this paragraph on eco-justice. It doesn't take long from that starting point before we recognize that there are justice implications, because these are not just individual decisions. Groups of people, the poor, the marginalized, the excluded, suffer in the way that the ecological communities and other species suffer. Justice issues about the treatment of human beings are raised immediately when you make this shift toward the land ethic. It doesn't just include non-human residents of these ecosystems. All ethics, Leopold says, rest upon a single premise that the individual is a member of a community of independent parts. This has implications for our understanding of the self. We haven't even gotten to theology yet, or the religious dimension. This is just studying ecology, in this case, what the Norwegian environmentalist Arne Næss called deep ecology. If reality is experienced by the ecological self, our behavior naturally and beautifully begins to follow norms of environmental ethics in the way that I've just described it. There's an encouragement in the transition to a new kind of self, which is related to the land in the way that Leopold has described. That's the key notion. If I had time, I would play for you this segment from Pale Blue Dot. It's a text by Carl Sagan, and he recognizes that it's on this planet alone that we live. We have no other place to go. This is our home. And only if we can find a way to live with each other on this land, on this planet, can we be able to survive. There is no other place to go. And when we kill people, when we decimate the land, when the dictator acts for his own selfishness and not for the good of the whole, then we find ourselves in danger of collapse. This is an insight that the atheist Carl Sagan was able to make and represents a deep understanding of what a land ethic entails, what it means to live. I'd encourage you to go to YouTube and just type in Pale Blue Dot. There are multiple versions of it, but any one of them conveys the same story. That then brings us back to the sciences, but with a fresh eye. So it's religion, science, but now with the eye on environmental science, on climate models, on the ecological sciences, understanding part-whole relations within ecosystems, between ecosystems, whether in extreme detail like energy exchange or chemical transformations in ecosystems, or in the broadest understanding of the Gaia hypothesis, understanding the biosphere as a whole as an interconnected system. Whichever level of the debate you're interested in, it gives you the chance to deepen yourself and immerse yourself in the sciences, but also the social sciences, as you can see from the examples that I offered there at the bottom. It takes us to metaphors drawn from the earth. So here is a grove called Pandopopulus. What's fascinating about this grove in Utah is it has a single root system, and therefore technically exists as a single organism. It makes it one of the oldest organisms on the planet. And this group of living trees with which is a single root system, being connected at the roots then becomes a metaphor for how we live with each other. This is science and a religion, a nature-inspired religion, beginning to draw out the values implications, as Carl Sagan, the atheist, does in Pale Blue Dot. We did a conference in 2015 with 2,000 people in that auditorium at Pomona College, Bill McKibben and others speaking, making this point of seizing an alternative, looking at ways in which humans are living sustainably on the planet. That led us then to found the Institute for Ecological Civilization that year. And that's been a heavy part of my responsibility over the last years as the president. The goal is to recognize what's required for an ecological way of living on this planet. The roots will involve all the sectors of human existence, energy and power and water and food, but also religion, culture, art. Each sector of civilization has a role in finding a way for humans to live sustainably with other species on this planet with equity for all in the long term. It is standard to show this, this picture of the interplay of the social, the economic, and the ecological, where each double overlap has a description, and the triple overlap of the three is genuine sustainability. Sustainability is often used in a very superficial way. This takes you far deeper in understanding that. I actually prefer this graph more because we recognize that the economy is a part of society and that society is a part of the environment, of the biosphere of this planet. Those cannot be separated. And yet contemporary economics, neoclassical or neoliberal economics, takes the view that one can study the economic system and everything else is left outside as a so-called externality. That would be an understanding of that social science that is a recipe for disaster for society and ultimately for the environment as a whole. Instead, Kate Raworth's notion of a donut economics represents something sustainable. So we take these factors of a healthy planetary ecosystem around the edges, that they represent the environmental ceiling for the safe and just space for humanity. And given that space, we can build a social foundation, equitable foundation, just foundation for all parts of human society, but only with the donut placed in this way and the outside being healthy. Beautiful, powerful way of drawing together these connections. Now what about religion? That's the science, those are the values, and that's the land ethic. But what about religion? Let's go back to Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan, in that same book, Pale Blue Dot, and you can read the text, says to religion, basically, you are too small. You have made your view of the universe too small, and as a result, you've made your God too small as well. And he says in response, a religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe, hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Now, his implication is that a religion of science or awe and reverence based only on the facts of the universe will be the most powerful. But actually, I disagree with that. I think that's incorrect. It is not that the conventional faiths have been left behind. It's that they have not moved into the space of their own religious resources, belief resources, practice resources, ethical resources in facing the world, the global crisis that we face today. Just think of the Muslim mystic, Sabistari. Each creature has its being from the one name from which it comes forth and to which it returns with praises unending. There is a power in that sense of a divine spirit that pervades all things, the universe as a whole, individual humans, communities of people, religious communities, but also all life whatsoever. I think it's the power of this, writing excerpt from The Secret Rose Garden from Shabastari, that the Nobel Prize winner Peter Doherty understood. Religion has a power to unify and to motivate in ways that most of the other resources don't. A theology of this sort, a theology which isn't tone deaf to the poetry and the mystical tug of writings like this, such a theology would have the ability to integrate mind, body, and spirit, to link together the ultimate source or ground of all things and the intimate experience of the moment, whether it's the experience of the mystic, of the ethical life, of embodied being in the forest or the home, the mother giving birth, the lovers, whatever aspect, theology has the ability to integrate all those pieces together. The biggest integration you can imagine, the integration of the out there, the universe as a whole, the empty spaces, and the in here, which is our own most experience of the world. And I suggest to you that such a theology, such a religion science can also challenge in a way that has not been done before. That is how I understand the birth and the power of ecofeminism and eco-womenism. Going back to Rosemary Radford Ruether's brilliant early book, New Woman, New Earth. And soon afterwards, as women of color recognized that the feminism they were hearing was colorblind, and they asked that this be expanded to include the race issue as well. Alice Walker writing, some of us have become used to thinking that woman is the nigger of the world, that a person of color is the nigger of the world, that a person is the nigger of the world. But in truth, Earth itself has become the nigger of the world. The only way that we can genuinely understand exclusion is to recognize exclusion of race. And when we are able to expand to the harshest forms of the treatment of others, then for the first time, we began to understand our treatment of the earth as a whole. Something so central in what Alice Walker and others did to birth eco-womenism that I think it now becomes a motive in the whole spectrum of theology for an eco-theology unlike anything else that exists. I'll have you read Rosemary Radford Ruether's famous text from Gaia and God, an eco-feminist theology of earth healing, where she brings together the treatment of the earth and gender, class, and racial domination, begins to recognize how central eco-justice is, both to speak of our domination of the earth and our social domination of each other. We don't have much time, she writes. Things are speeding up, like that chart of human population that I showed you a few minutes ago. That means that we need to move, she said, within the next generation, but that's now in this generation. A lot of the models say we have about a decade to begin the shift. And after that, the consequences across this century, and actually, if you do the models, for hundreds of years to come, will be fairly devastating. Elizabeth Johnson asks us to go back to biblical documents and says that we can allow an ecological view to emerge when we can recognize how God accompanies creation through all time with mercy, which in our day encompasses the planet in peril. So for her, a theology, a more holistic theology of salvation, linked to the planet, is reflected in the Gospels and in the biblical narratives. The death of Christ becomes an icon of God's redemptive co-suffering with all sentient life, as well as, like Rosemary, as well as with the victims of social competition. Citing Niels Gregerson. I just want to give you a sense of what a rich area of theology has been by and large ignored in the science and religion discussion. Many areas across theology contribute here. Many themes within systematic theology make their contribution, get rethought in an eco-theology, and become more relevant for a science-religion discourse than before. The number of works that laid the foundation is impossible to list on a single slide. And yet somehow these works have played a very small role in the sort of canonical science and religion discussions. The collections likewise have been available. Some of our colleagues in the field have been involved in putting these together, but they seem to have taken rather of a back seat for a while now. In recent years, the pace has picked up. And again, people whom we know in the religion science discourse are publishing, and yet they don't seem to be carrying that sort of weight as we begin to think how to reboot science and religion that they should be carrying. So I want to close then with a thought on what it means to do theology in a time of crisis. However, I'd like to take Trip and Sarah's title and alter it, Theology for a Time of Crisis. That is, it's not just we happen to be doing theology in an age where we're surrounded by crisis, but we actually rethink what theology is so that it becomes in service of the age we live in. Karl Barth's early work was called Eine Krisentheologie, theology of crisis. I'm not sure that that phrase is helpful. I don't think that we should do theology only in crisis mode, but that phrase, the understanding of a theology of crisis or theology for a time of crisis, is a corrective for theologizing that easily becomes too abstract, whether through exclusive emphasis on analysis and conceptual clarification on the one hand, or through an exclusive demand for systematic, rigorous breadth on the other hand. Neither of those gives us what we need, and the Barth's phrase, the Krisentheologie, strikes me as one that will help bring that balance back. I would prefer to speak of a theology that's suitable for this kairos moment, this moment of the intersection of ages, of civilizations. In short, a prophetic theology. My thesis is that the rebooting of science and religion needs the resources from multiple religions, and on the Christian side, a far more prophetic or liberation-based theology than has played a role in theology science discussions to this point. An eco-liberation theology where we can hear the God of Jesus through the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, as Leonardo Boff's book puts it. That means that we start with the sense of the commons and of Acts 2 and 4. They shared all things in common immediately after Pentecost, but now it's a creation commons that is included. It's an expansion of that first lifestyle decision that we know of the church after the giving of the Holy Spirit. What would it be for that to become a creation commons as well? That leads us directly then to a theology of the earth, which would include especially its poorest inhabitants. What Catherine Keller in her recent Political Theology of the Earth calls a hunchback theology. Therefore, theology that doesn't just belong to the wealthy and powerful. It also leads, and with this I need to close, to a different kind of hope. We've been happy to spell out hope in the context of the eschaton, a final hope, a hope for the salvation of the soul, often a hope after the body's been left behind, the planet's been left behind is unimportant. Maybe through a rapture where we're carried up into the heavens to be with God immediately, to bypass the age of the collapse of the earth. That kind of hope is no longer helpful, I believe. And instead, we need a hope not linked to a kind of certitude. Think of how philosophers of religion, Christian theologians, have read that verse in Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. And then to those two words, we add all the epistemic weight we possibly can, so we get virtual epistemic certainty through the mechanism of faith. We need a different kind of hope. It's rather difficult to propose that style of hope, looking at the climate data, what the sciences are telling us. We need to think of a different kind of hope. Now I suggest, as the title of Joseph Winter's book puts it, it's a hope draped in black. This is, as Rebecca Solnit says, a time for hope in the dark. This is a hope, a depth of theology that we can access, but now not in that exceptionalist way, in that victorious way, in the certitude that we avoid the suffering that, unfortunately, the wealthy Christians, have largely brought about since this process started in Europe and North America. It's a hope tinged with lament, as the Ugandan theologian Emmanuel Katongole says. He writes often of lament in his work. The birth of hope in lament, hope in ruins, trauma hope. And as Catherine Keller then adds, combined with the attentive practices of thought, love, rage, and care. That represents a different kind of theology to bring into debate and discussion with science and other religious traditions. So in conclusion, I do advocate, on the Christian side, a political theology of the earth, one in which we are folded into one another, members of one another. But of course, I advocate a theology that's not just drawn from the Christian tradition, but that draws from the wrestling with God tradition in Judaism, the focus on the ethical, the resistance to the sharp dualism that the Christians had done, the resistance to the subjectification of religion, and the focus on observance, on what one actually does, that's been at the heart of most Jewish thought. The Islamic tradition of the power of God in our own place as vice-regents, together with the mystical Sufi tradition that recognized the unity of all things, as in the quotation I showed you earlier, but also the underutilized contributions of the religions of the East. Sadly, they continue to play a very small role in most discussions of science religion in the West. And this rebooting, motivated by the ecological crisis and the hope draped in black, will require those insights from those traditions, whether it's the balance of yin and yang in Taoist traditions and Tao Te Ching, whether it's the sense of the harmony that's at the core of Confucianism with Tian or heaven, balance with humans and nature in a sustainable way, whether it's the recognition that all causes and conditions are connected together, as you find in the teachings of the Buddha, and this deep insight of pratitya samutpada, the codependence of all things. This one being given, that arises. That acting, this arises. That network of causes and conditions that we can never escape from is what draws our attention back to the planet and what we're doing to ecosystems. And then the recognition that the divine is radically inclusive of all things without being reduced to all things, that you find in the Vedantic traditions of Hinduism, the so-called Orthodox schools, and in the devotionalism, bhakti tradition of Ramanuja, and in the great mystical teachings of Shankara, for whom the ultimate truth is Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, and bliss. That's the rebooting of science and religion that we need. It's a rebooting that has a place for and calls for a theology for a time of crisis. It's a transformative, values-based, and liberation-oriented science and religion. It's for that I make my plea.